Now, Dr. Rick, how do you translate the first verse of the Bible? Do you agree with the translation when God began to create?
Yeah, this is such a kind of interesting thing. And of course, my goodness, Genesis 1 is so full of questions and issues. I did several videos on my own website about them, but this is certainly one of the big questions. The first word in the Bible in Hebrew is Bereshit. And in the traditional translation, we translate it in the beginning. And then God, and then the next word is created, and then the next word is God, as Hebrew puts it in that order. But in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the question is, what is that sort of little one word in Hebrew, but it's a bit of a clause, at least in English, in the beginning, and how is it to be understood? And actually, if you take it the way the Jewish scribes in the 8th and 9th centuries AD recorded what they heard, because before that the text wasn't vocalized, and so people just had an oral tradition of how it was read. They read that the very first syllable, a very short b, bereshit, rather than a long bareshit. So they read it Bereshit. It actually does suggest that you've got this sort of constructed with what follows, as the Hebrew grammarians say. And so it's in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth. Or when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then you can play with it all you want, because then the question arises, is it just when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without, then the earth was without form and void? Or is it when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and when the earth was without form and void, and when darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the waters, then God said, let there be light. So you got a long sentence there at the beginning. Well, actually, a long clause. It's what we would call a relative clause, sort of a temporal clause. But the part of the problem, frankly, is that if we go back and look in the earlier records, and I'm talking about a Christian scholar by the name of Origen, who in 200, as early as the early 200s AD, recorded how what he heard in Hebrew was pronounced. Was it Bereshit or Bareshit? And he recorded that. The problem is the records we have of him attest to both readings. So it's not really helpful, other than to know that at least there was a tradition that read it not when in the beginning, but in the beginning. And you see, this is kind of important, because if it's all a circumstantial clause, when in the beginning God created the earth, the heavens and the earth, then verse 2 very much, or verse 3, becomes sort of a follow-on. And particularly if verse 2 is like that, then the earth was, when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then the earth was without form and void. And it becomes kind of a way of looking at creation as though there were things floating around that God then took and put together. And at least in New Testament Christian confession, certainly Colossians 1 and other texts pretty firmly attest that God creates out of nothing. And of course, this is very important also for the view of God as being truly sovereign, that there's no little piece of matter floating around or force somewhere that he didn't create, that ultimately he doesn't have control of. And so, coming back to this, the part of the issue or problem is there is no exact word like that anywhere else in the Bible. Bereshit does not appear. Now, in texts like Proverbs 8:22, we have one of the closer examples where we do have that reshit, or a form of that, where it says wisdom is from the beginning, and it talks that way. And the clause there, where we have an example like that, is kind of a straightforward small clause. the first of his works, the beginning of his works. The Lord brought me forth as the beginning of his works. And that's understood as a separate clause. It's not when the works began and the Lord brought, it's not all put together like that. And so there is some evidence in terms of some of the comparisons that we have that in fact this should be translated in the beginning and not when in the beginning. Now I know that goes against some other, particularly the most famous of the ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, Enuma Elish, which is a Babylonian account which begins when on high the gods decided. But if you read that account, I invite you to read it in a good translation, you'll see that it bears no resemblance to Genesis 1. Genesis 1, with its 7 days of creation and everything else, is its own account. And what we do know about the way Hebrew stories, narratives work, is that they often begin with a summary statement or with a kind of summary, which then they go back to the beginning of that summary and retell the story in more detail. And I think this, by the way, even you see between Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis 1:1 to 2:4a, and then 2:4b starts again and kind of goes back and retells the story, but from a different perspective and a different emphasis. But you see it elsewhere, sometimes even so that it's kind of difficult to otherwise interpret. For example, in the story of Rahab in Genesis 2, Rahab's letting the spies out. It says she let the spies down the wall, and then they say, well, and then she tells them where to go and what to do. Well, that doesn't make any sense if she's trying to be secret. What are they doing? Dangling on the wall with the cord and shouting up to Rahab, or on at the bottom? That would hardly work if they're trying to be secret and move away without being noticed out of her house and being let out on the side of the wall. But no, I think that's a summary statement. She let them out, let them through a rope, and then it goes back and goes back to the scene in her house, in that room where she's explaining to them what to do, and then she dismisses them and they go. She lets them down again. And I think that's what's going on here. I think Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, is a summary. It's a summary statement. And then we go, and verse 2 then begins. And I think verse 2, by the way, I think is a poetic way of saying there wasn't anything there. And then it begins with the creation account. So that's my take on Genesis 1:1 and that first word and how it's best understood.